Okay, well, thank you for that, and I'll try to answer these as quickly as I can. Abdullah pointed out that there were many different halves, or these different words of the Qur'an, but the references that I gave in Bukhari actually showed here that these are more than just different way that words can be said, but there's a whole lot of different extra words there. So there are real textual variants. The difference you've got to remember is that while with the New Testament we've got manuscripts we can look at, the earliest Qur'ans were all burnt. So there's actually no evidence to look at because of this wholesale burning and standardising. Now Christians haven't done that to their texts. As I pointed out, they weren't in one set of hands, and there's a big difference between having burnt all your early manuscripts and not having burnt them. Yes, we've got differences within ours, but we haven't burnt them to standardise one text, and I think that is significant to say. He also mentioned Andrew Rippon referring to the Sana manuscripts, and the Sana manuscripts are now becoming available, and there's a whole lot of differences in them. They actually follow, some of them, the order of Ibn Masud, and sometimes within the one Qur'an it actually shows its development over time, in that the Qur'an will be written in an early script and then have other pages put in at a later script, actually developing that Qur'an. So there are some scholars who are saying that the Qur'an was actually showing development within the late 7th, early 8th century. He quoted the Adrian Brockett quote, but Adrian Brockett actually says something else in his articles where he refers to Surah 2, verse 184, and he says, I don't know the exact quote, but I'll find it. It's along the lines of, none of the differences have a major effect on meaning, apart from chapter 2, verse 184. That may have some wider effect. But certainly the differences that he mentioned do change it. If you make it a ta or a ya, it goes from being possibly a he to a we. It can move it around from being an active to a passive. So there are some verses where it will say the prophets killed, and the other will say the prophets were killed, which change the sentence and the meaning of the sentence around. With the example I gave, in one it's Muhammad speaking, in the other it's God. That's a difference. Changing these dots makes a massive difference. In fact, changing the dots has a huge effect for the oral tradition of the Qur'an, because normally we're told that the oral tradition of the Qur'an predates the text, and that what we have is this oral tradition that's come down safely to us. However, when you look at the differences between the different oral traditions of the 10 readers that I mentioned, the differences are almost exclusively to do with, not completely, but overwhelmingly, where the dots go. And so because it's the vagueness of the original Arabic script, which didn't actually spell the whole word. When Abdullah was saying, you see how the structure is the same, you need to understand that word in Arabic is not fully spelt. You need to have the dots and dashes to fully spell out what it is. Now, because the different oral traditions vary at the exact point where the text is vague, it actually means that the text is the source of the oral traditions. And so the oral traditions we have today are actually the result of the text, and then they're secondary to the text, not primary to it. Moving on to the Gospels, he said it's the gospel. They accept the gospel given to Jesus and not according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Well, first of all, as I've shown, you've got the Qur'an according to Ibn Hafs, Ibn Warsh, and so you don't just get the Qur'an straight anyway. So there's a similarity there. But also, there's no historical evidence at all that Jesus actually gave the gospel this way. The gospel is what God did through Jesus. It's not just what Jesus recited and said to them, but it's what he did, because what he did was the fulfillment of the promises of the Old Testament. And this is actually one way that we can be certain. Abdullah was asking for how we can be certain. Well, we can be certain because there are parts in the Bible which have very clear prophecies about what the future will look like, how God will save his people. And Jesus fulfills those. And so I have no doubt when I read passages like Isaiah 53, which talk about God's suffering servant. I don't have that on a PowerPoint I can show you at the moment. But when I read those, I can see that what the gospel talks about is true. For instance, the doctrine of the Son of God, it's there in the law of Moses. Israel's called the Son of God. In the Psalm 8, humanity is called, the image of God is in Moses. The image of God is in the Psalms. The image of God is in Ezekiel. The image of God is in the book of Daniel. The image of God is in the Gospels and the letters. But the image of God, humanity being made in the image of God, is not in the Qur'an. The Qur'an doesn't have any understanding. It doesn't teach about circumcision, doesn't even mention circumcision or God's covenant that he made with Abraham. So many of the main messages of the prophets just aren't even in the Qur'an. But they're in the New Testament and they come to its fulfillment. And it's this coherence that actually tells us that this was the correct Gospels and this is the correct Gospel account. Now, he mentioned that historians, and he quoted some early critics there, saying that the Gospels are all just made up, that modern historians do not treat that or say that at all about the Gospels. If you just read mainstream secular historians, they actually consult the Bible, and because the New Testament is actually, the Gospels are full of information about Jesus went from here to there and he went downhill. He travelled about this far. Now, for historians, that is gold, because that is actually where you can test it, you can judge it, you can see does it match up. See, when the Qur'an talks about Jesus, it doesn't have any place. Jesus is just there. In fact, it even talks about Jesus' mother being Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron. And so the stories of the prophets in the Qur'an are just in this world of story. They're not linked into any time or space. However, historians take the New Testament very seriously. I'd refer you to John Dixon's books on that, where he explains that, and there's a great introduction. Now, he also mentioned that in Matthew 21:44 that there's not a verse in the oldest copies, and there's some sections in John's Gospel about a woman being caught in adultery, the end of Mark's Gospel also. Yes, and Christians are very open about that. But as I pointed out with some of these manuscripts here, so the one on the left, that ancient manuscript has 2 extra surahs in it. These are surahs 115 and 116. Now, Muslims could put those in their Qur'ans and just put a footnote saying, well, you know, these are in the old manuscripts. They're there. So there are whole surahs that aren't in the modern Qur'an. So there are textual variants that could be listed in the footnotes from amongst the manuscripts, from amongst the hadith, from amongst these extra surahs. They could be added in there, but when you're given a Qur'an, it's not given those. How am I going for time? So we've got 3 minutes. Let's see what else I can do. I think you made a reference at the beginning of Mark to Mark quoting Exodus and Isaiah. I think it's Malachi and Isaiah. I didn't have a chance to look it up. But what he does there is actually a common thing of combining 2 similar prophecies to show how they come to their fulfillment. And that just happens. That's part of the way that they communicate. You spoke about circumcision with Paul and that Paul was a liar. No, Paul wasn't using lie or deceit. He was saying that circumcision has now come to its fulfillment in Christ, and that what matters is that our hearts are circumcised through the removal of sin that Jesus Christ brings through his death on the cross. And it's the removal of that flesh, and so all Christians are circumcised. What Paul said was that circumcision is now a matter of freedom. He said you're free to be circumcised or not to be circumcised. It's a matter of your own cultural identity now. And so on some occasions he would do it, others he wouldn't. There's no problem there. There's no deceit at all. The final quote I'll go to is from Dr. Abdullah Zaid from Melbourne University. And he writes this. He says, I'll have to turn around for this. Since the authorised scriptures of the Jews and Christians remain very much today as they existed at the time of the prophet, it is difficult to argue that the Quranic references to Torah and Injil were only to the pure Torah and Injil that existed at the time of Moses and Jesus, respectively. If the texts have remained more or less as they were in the 7th century, the reverence the Qur'an has shown them at the time should be retained even today. Many interpreters of the Qur'an, from Tabari to Razi to Ibn Taymiyyah and even Khattab, appear to be inclined to share this view. The wholesale dismissive attitude held by many Muslims from the modern period towards the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity does not seem to have support in either the Qur'an or the modern tafsir, the figures of tafsir. And that's Abdullah Zaid. He heads the Islamic University work in Australia. I'll finish there. Thank you.
All right, thank you again, Samuel. You posted some very interesting points. I think one thing that is very important to emphasise to the non-Muslims here is that there's a very big difference between a hadith and the Qur'an. A massive difference, okay? The Qur'an, we say, is clear, it's certain, we know that the Qur'an came from God, okay? A hadith are completely separate altogether. Now, yes, Samuel has quoted from Sahih al-Bukhari, which is one of our more trusted collections of ahadith, and it's probably accepted by, about 99% of all Sunni non-Muslims. However, it's important to understand that there's different classifications of ahadith. Okay? And one classification, which fits in all the ones that Samuel quoted, is ahad. What that means is one, okay, singular. It's narrated by one person or through one chain of narrators. Now, that isn't considered enough for a Muslim to be certain for belief. Okay? So when we're quoting from ahadith that are referring to how the Qur'an developed and how it was collected, etc., if these ahadith, which all of these ones were, are ahad, or narrated only by one person through one chain, it's not something that we certainly believe. And all Muslims will agree with you. Now, and what I'm saying right now. Now, it's very important also to understand that there are differences of opinion as to what classifies a reliable hadith or hadith or saying and what doesn't. Okay? And Muslims have written thousands and thousands of books on these. Hundreds were already written by about the 3rd Islamic century, and classifying the different sayings into different categories. And I'm certainly not a scholar of that science, but it's important that you as an individual go away and sort of look at those, because don't think that we just take them on face value. We have explanations, and we also then have explanations of the explanations and disagreements between scholars, etc. Whereas with the Qur'an, everybody agrees that this is what the Qur'an says. Now remember, the structure, as I said, the structure is the same. Now if Samuel's going to say that, it's not just the structure that's important, it's also those dots and those small vowels, well then where does that leave the Old Testament? Now the oldest version of the Old Testament that everybody's got is the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now the Dead Sea Scrolls are written in classical Hebrew. As I said, classical Hebrew, being a Semitic language, does not distinguish between some consonants that are similar in Arabic, and it doesn't have short vowels. So can you understand the Old Testament? Likewise, to say that it's impossible to understand the Qur'an without these markers is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Because these markers in the Arabic language didn't exist until about the 2nd or 3rd Islamic century. Okay? Muslims were already writing commentaries on the Qur'an before they existed. So did they not know what the Qur'an meant? It's ridiculous. Having said that, I am very pleased with the hadith that Samuel quoted, because they all do refer to essentially what I was saying, that the rasam, or the foundation of the text, has not changed. Now there are some issues there that are probably open for interpretation. I'll actually quote one for all of you here today. Okay, there's 2 ahadith in the collection of Imam Malik, one of the earliest ahadith collections, where it's narrated that 2 different wives of the Prophet, one being Aisha and one being Hafsa, said that in a verse that's currently contained in the Qur'an, and in the middle prayer, they added the words, the Asr prayer. Okay, we have 5 prayers every day, and each one has a different title depending on the time of the day. One is the Asr prayer. Okay, now these 2 ahadith have been known for centuries, from the very beginning of when they were recorded, roughly about 100 years after the death of the Prophet, as being explanations of the Qur'an. Because people read that verse, and guard the middle prayer. And they wanted to know, well, which one's the middle prayer? We've got 5, which one? Okay, and so people were explaining that. And most of what you see in the manuscripts that Samuel put up, the additions are explanations of the Qur'an. Okay, just like would be written in Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament, explanations, not the text, explanations. Okay, you can't miss the differentiation between the 2. Again, Samuel quoted some differences between Hafs and Warsh, albeit not super specifically. In fact, didn't really give any clear examples and didn't quote a specific example of Adrian Brockett other than just the surah number, and also didn't quote a scholar, whether it be Muslim or non-Muslim, that agrees with his understanding of how the Qur'an was collected. And as I said, there are differences in the mode of recitation. Now, as I said, the Old Testament has at the very least 3 modes of recitation: the Ashkenazi recitation, the Sephardi recitation, and the Yemeni or the Tamimi recitation. These are all completely different. Okay, the meaning of the words is the same, all right, but the way that it sounds is completely different. And someone that only understands Ashkenazi Hebrew, say being me, will have very great difficulty understanding Yemeni Hebrew, particularly when it's being read, the Old Testament. It makes very little sense to me. Okay, so recitation differences don't change the meaning of the text, and to suggest that is to put your own text at ransom. Now, yes, the Apostle Paul does say in one instance where you can choose circumcision or not. I can't remember what epistle that's in, but he's quoted quite clearly, or it's illustrated quite clearly in Acts, that Paul circumcised Timothy because Timothy's father was a Greek and he would not be accepted by the Jews. What does that mean? When Paul said, if you become circumcised, you are cut off from Christ. Okay, that's accepting the old law. And if you're under the old law, you're not under the law of Christ. What does that mean? Now, Samuel was also up here speaking about coherence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, that's not coherent. It was said to Abraham quite clearly, your children will be circumcised. Jesus himself was circumcised. Why is it changing in the New Testament? You may have a theological reason for that, and that's open for you. But it also says, other things in the Old Testament, like God is not a man that he should change his mind. And that doesn't leave the door open for him to be a God-man either. That's just an exercise in semantics. It also says quite clearly that, yes, it certainly says in the Hebrew that God created humanity in his image. And it says quite clearly in the Qur'an that God breathed his spirit into Adam and also into Jesus as well, for Jesus to be created. Okay? This is essentially what it's referring to. And I'd argue that from a theological standpoint, and this isn't really for me to do tonight, but from a theological standpoint, there's very little difference, unless you want to say God has hands and feet like us, there's very little difference between what we say and what you understand, because for us, the very Spirit of God that we all have in us to some degree is that image. Okay, it's what differentiates us from the dogs and the cats outside, if that makes sense. Now, I've also spoken very briefly about the canon of the Old Testament. I'll just let Samuel know, perhaps he doesn't, that there was a Sanhedrin or a Jewish council in the first Christian century that determined what the Hebrew canon would be. That was defined reasonably early on. The Christian canon, however, wasn't collected until about 350. And even then it was fluid for a long time afterwards. Okay, so some of our earliest and best complete New Testament manuscripts have books that some of you have probably not even heard of, like the Shepherd of Hermas. Okay? I'd be very interested to see how many Christians here have actually read that. That was considered canon for about 1,000 years, and then considered not to be canon. Okay? Martin Luther himself said that Revelation should not be considered part of the canon. Martin Luther. Okay, now obviously you being majority Anglicans, I assume here, or at least majority Protestants, will respect him to some degree. He said that Revelation is not part of the canon. In fact, John Calvin also did not write a commentary on Revelation. It was the only book he didn't write a commentary on. So really question, what are you talking about in terms of canon? Now, as I said, our story is that the Qur'an was well and truly canonised before the time of Uthman. And the Sana'a manuscripts give the evidence of that. So far, there's been not a single scholar that said there are differences, like Samuel said, in the Sana'a manuscripts, and I genuinely look forward to any individual that proposes that. They are available on the UN website, as I said, and I'll be more than happy to give that website to anybody later on this evening. Thank you very much.